The segregation that we have here in Jerusalem is very much one of bureaucracy. It's very much one of policy and rules and law, where you have one set of laws for one part of the population, another set of laws for another part of the population, based on lines of ethnicity. That is apartheid, that is segregation.
So what is the right diagnosis? What is the diagnosis here? Is the problem here that we have occupation? I don't think so. I think that that's a symptom of the problem. Is the problem the wall? No, that's also a symptom. What is the etiology of this problem? You know, it was there before the occupation, before the wall, before the settlements here in the West Bank. There is a problem here. What is that problem? Where did it come from? How did it come? What's the genesis of it? How did it evolve? As a disease also has stages and evolution. And so what is the evolution of this condition, if you want, of this patient, if we consider Palestine a patient?
How do you define a democracy? You define a democracy by the laws and how it treats its minorities. That's how you define a democracy. And I'll be showing you how Israel is far from being a democracy.
To help us identify the etiology, the diagnosis, we have to think, when did it start? You know, one was, by the way, the first Palestinian uprising. 1881, we had our first Palestinian uprising. So obviously the people who did the uprising against something, that something started obviously before this date, before 1881. And that was the first Zionist colony in Palestine, 1880. Now, why did the Palestinians object to this first Zionist colony in Palestine? Some Jews will tell you it has to do with anti-Semitism. But that's not true. We welcomed Jews after the Russian pogroms, for example, in the 19th century. They came and they settled, became native Palestinians. We welcomed Armenians after the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Turks, and they came here and settled, tens of thousands of them. They even have an old quarter of Jerusalem is Armenian. And they became native people. Circassians, Druze, Ethiopians, everybody came here and settled, and nobody objected to them settling here, so to speak. So the problem has nothing to do with the presence of people of particular religions or backgrounds or anything else.
Now, I want you guys to imagine, let's go back all together, we'll go back to the 1920s. The British are ruling the place. You've got Zionists coming here who, through the JNF, have already started buying land in historic Palestine and building. You've got the Palestinians who are slowly rising to a small but significant uprising against the Zionists. You've got the British who are trying to keep the peace between the two, right? And trying to rule as the British Empire in the Middle East. And one of the things that the British Empire did, and the British Mandate did, was write something called the White Paper. As a result of this, one of the things that we had of the White Paper is that they put a cap on the amount of Jewish migration that could come to this region. As a result of that sprung up these sort of Zionist militias that went by the name of Lehi, Palmach, Haganah, that in 1948 ended up becoming the Israeli army.
The resistance of the people is like your white blood cells' immune response to infection. It's a natural process. It's a natural process when you have an illness for your body to try and deal with it. And it would be totally unnatural. You cannot find any examples in history where the native people just said, oh, you know, welcome, if you want, take the country over and change us and kill us and remove us from our land and make it your country. Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome, you know. That doesn't happen, you know. If I come to your house and say, I like your house, it's a nice house, would you please go away? You know, you're not going to do it. You know, it's common sense, okay, that the native people will resist. And it's just like common sense that the white blood cells of your body will resist to varying degrees. And to varying successes, by the way. They may be overwhelmed by the incoming illness. But it is natural to try and resist.
that Israel did to the Bedouins in 1948, which is very similar to what the Americans were doing 200 years ago with the native Indians, and which is why I'm saying Zionism is very much a colonialist ideology, and the tactics that Israel uses today as a colony are the same tactics that have been used for hundreds of years by many different colonies. You know, the Zionists didn't invent colonialism. The Dutch were doing it back in the 15th century. It just happens to be happening right here, right now in 2014.
And this resistance for local people, for native people, is by and large, 99% of it is non-armed resistance. Why? Because it's also natural. I mean, most people do not have either the access to arms or the capacity to carry arms or the moral fortitude to go shoot at somebody or anything. You know, it's natural that the native people do not resist by armed methods by and large. They resist mostly by non-violent methods. There is, of course, some that resist by armed methods. That's also natural, by the way. You know, there is a bell-shaped curve of resistance, like any statistical phenomena, and you find some of it in one extreme that involves arms, whatever. Most of the people resist non-violently, and there's a group of people here at the other end that do collaboration.
End of the British Mandate, they hand over the keys to the newly formed United Nations. And the United Nations puts together a commission made up of 7 different countries. And these countries were tasked with coming up with a solution for Israel and Palestine, for the Jews and the Palestinians. And the first solution they came up with was a one-state solution, secular and democratic. And the Zionist part of the delegation refused to accept this solution.
And by the way, it's not unique in human history. We mentioned other examples. I can mention to you other examples that are more similar to this. For example, one could say, well, the European Jews, because Judaism comes from here and they were discriminated against and they had to come here, so that's somehow unique. And I'm sorry, that's not unique, because black Americans, for example, they were discriminated against. They were brought as slaves to America. And when they were discriminated against, at some point, some blacks said, well, you know, heck with this, let's go make our own country. And they went and made a country called Liberia. Of course, Liberia was not a land without a people for a people without a land, so they face the same problem as Zionism faces here, which is the native people. And there is, to this day, by the way, there is a problem between Liberian Americans and the Liberian natives. It's just the reality. And the Liberian Americans are, of course, the ones running the country, discriminating against the native ones.
So, partition plan. This was the second solution that the United Nations came up with for Israel and Palestine. And what are we looking at this map? What we're seeing on here is in grey, this was going to be the future Palestinian state. What we see in yellow was going to be the future Jewish state. Now, nobody in 1947 looked at this map and said, ah, yes, there are 2 viable states on this map. Everything is going to be just fine. No.
You know, we can justify, not justify, you know, but the answer to me that the people who resisted discrimination, like Martin Luther King, Edwin Douglas, and, you know, Malcolm X and those guys, was a more appropriate answer for discrimination than the answer that those who set up Liberia gave. And the same thing I say for European Jews. The answer that the Bund and socialist Jews and other Jews who resisted discrimination and died in the Warsaw Ghetto even, many of them, were anti-Zionist. That was their answer. The answer was not to go to Palestine. Their answer was, you fight. There's discrimination, you have to fight against it.
Israel is a very secular state. Out of the region's 6 million Jews, only about 12% are religious, having, you know, 10, 12, 15 babies. Most young Israelis, my generation, look like myself, very secular. I'm 31 years old, I'm not married, I don't have kids. A lot of my friends are in the same situation. Not interested, we're enjoying our freedom far too much, thank you very much. We're not having enough Jewish babies. The other aspect is that there has been no large wave of Jewish migration to this region since the fall of the Soviet Union, when in the early 1990s, about 1.3, 1.4 million Russian Jews came to live in this area. The Jewish demographic spiked. Now, whether or not all of those Russians were actually Jewish or not is not for our conversation today. Let's just say that they were. Now, that was back in the early 1990s. There's been no large wave of Jewish migration since. Now, if you cannot increase your Jewish population by them having more Jewish babies or by having a large Jewish migration come here, what is the next best thing you can do? You reduce your Palestinian population, your non-Jewish population. Now it's the year 2014. You can't go around and massacre them all at once because it's the year 2014. So what is the next best thing you can do? You create laws and bureaucracy and policies that make life so difficult for the non-Jewish population living here that they just up and leave themselves. And this is what ICAD refers to as the silent transfer or the quiet transfer, where Israel is making life so difficult for this non-Jewish population that they just up and leave.
But why does Palestine have a problem with having a Jewish state in Palestine? Why do we have a problem with a Jewish state in Palestine? I think, it's rather obvious. If you talk about an Islamic state, or you talk about a white state, or you talk about any kind of state that's characterized for a particular subset of people, we have a problem with it. So that is the reason why this was rejected in 1881 with an uprising. And it was rejected very strongly, although non-violently, without arms at that period. So when the Israeli state was formulated as such that it would be built into a Jewish state, in 1897, sent 2 rabbis to Palestine to see how suitable it is for a Jewish state. And the 2 rabbis came, studied the country. They found out that 97% of the population was not Jewish, and that the country is heavily farmed and very well industrialized and successful country. And the 2 rabbis sent a telegram back to Vienna, where Herzl was, and the telegram simply said, "The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man." It's a wonderful country for a Jewish state, but there are people here. What are we going to do with these people?
On November 27th, 1947, the United Nations passed one of the most important international laws that we have today, and that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights goes for every single one of us as individual human beings. There was a war. The war lasted for 2 years. At the end of the war, this is what the map looked like. What actually happened in the Nakba. And the Nakba means a catastrophe. It's what the Israelis refer to as the War of Independence. In this area of yellow here that we today call the State of Israel, there were over 800,000 Palestinians. At the end of the war, there were 50,000 left. 750,000 Palestinians were killed or forcefully evicted from their homes. Israel demolished over 500 Palestinian villages. That's ethnic cleansing.
They said that the native people are an obstacle, sort of like the Native Americans were an obstacle to European colonization. Because you don't want to maintain the character of the country as a country of native tribes. Each tribe has a territory and responsible for it, whatever. You want to change it to a different structure. And this structure, in this case, is the Jewish state of Israel.
From 1949 to 1966, the entire area of historic Palestine, what we today call Israel, was under martial law for non-Jews. That meant that curfews were put in place like that, IDs would have to be produced the moment that they were requested. Now, if you're putting an entire population of non-Jews under martial law, from 1949 to 1966, that's 19 years of martial law. That is enough time to indoctrinate a population and ensure that they know exactly who's in charge. 1967, Israel occupies the West Bank and Jerusalem. There are calls immediately from both the left wing and the right wing to unoccupy the territories, to get out of the West Bank. And there are three reasons why Israel did not unoccupy the West Bank in 1967. The first reason is religion. If you read the Old Testament, the majority of places mentioned in the Old Testament are in the West Bank. So the religious lobby was very powerful and strong in convincing the government not to unoccupy. The second reason is strategy, military. The West Bank is physically higher up than the rest of the country, which means you can look out your so-called enemies in the east and protect your country on the west. And the third reason is water. Under the West Bank, you have the largest aquifers in this region. In a semi-arid environment, water is like gold. Under the settlement of Ariel, you have the largest aquifer in the West Bank. In the 1970s, Israel starts building settlements.
The reason they fail is, first and foremost, is the diversity of people here. And the fact that people who are not part of this selected religion or chosen community are not, of course, to accept that they are inferior, are not going to say, oh yeah, we're slaves, it's okay, you know. No, they will fight back, they will reject. So the primary and main reason is the rejection by the other people. And the other people are always a majority. The other people are always a majority. And this is part of the reason for the failure, is that aspect. Now, this minority that tries to do the transformation cannot win by arguments or by logic or by discussion or by nonviolent resistance or anything else. The only tool available to them is, of course, the weapons and the technology and the support of Western countries. And so these people who try to transform the society into something that it rejects generally are faced with having to use weapons and arms and killings. And they think that this is the way to get their way. Temporarily it works. On the short run it works.
So 1987, guys, the Palestinians start the first intifada. The word intifada means shaking off. They were shaking off the occupation. Now, prior to 1987, the Palestinians have a long history of resistance, going back to the 1920s. But it was the first intifada that forced Israel to realize that there was a nation of people who had the rights to self-determination. So then you had the start of the Madrid talks and then Oslo. Now, Oslo basically overtook the Madrid talks. And the Norwegians got this peace process going. In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, negotiating with the Palestinians, was assassinated by a right-wing settler, put an end to the Oslo Accord negotiations, with Netanyahu saying that he would agree to fulfill some of the obligations. There were two sets of negotiations that happened after that. You had the Hebron agreements and the Wye River agreements, which basically dealt with issues of security. We're jumping now to the year 2000. Year 2000, you have Camp David, and you have Ehud Barak's generous offer. Effectively, Ehud Barak was offering Yasser Arafat a state that has no continuity, no international borders, no access to water, and most importantly, no access to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the largest Palestinian city. You have over 306,000 Palestinians living in Jerusalem. How could it not be connected to the future state? Ehud Barak, Yasser Arafat says thanks, but no thanks. He doesn't want to be remembered as the guy who sold out the Palestinian people to this deal. Ehud Barak comes back to the Israelis and says, we have no partner for peace. And that has been the mantra for the last 14 years. You ask any Israeli about Camp David and he will say to you, we offered them everything, they said no, it's their problem. And it's important to understand that this is a tactic that Israel uses again and again in negotiations, where they offer things to the Palestinians that they know politically they have to say no to. So then Israel can continue to claim victimhood. We offered them everything, we did everything, it's their problem, it's their fault. It's something that Israel's become very, very good at.
So they are stuck with us. They're stuck with us. Who is us? We are 12 million Palestinians. 7 million of us are refugees or displaced people. And the other 5 million are the ones living either inside the Green Line or in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, of course. And those who live inside, if you want, are subjected to apartheid laws, racist apartheid laws. There are over 50 of them within the Green Line that discriminate against non-Jews within the Green Line. Outside the Green Line, in the West Bank and Gaza, there are many more laws that discriminate against non-Jews. Those are called military orders. Israeli commanders here in the West Bank, for example, can issue any kind of commandment, and it becomes essentially law because it's applied by force by the military. And so these are hundreds of military orders. There's, I think, over 1,000 now. These military orders are all essentially violations of human rights and discriminatory laws against the Palestinians.
The next time they went sat down for negotiations properly, between 2008 and 2010, was it Olmert who was in charge? Or still Barak? Olmert met with Yasser Arafat 36 times in 2 years. 2010, they decided to make a settlement freeze. As a sort of goodwill gesture, we're going to freeze settlement building. However, what was written in the agreement of the settlement freeze? That any building that already had foundations laid could continue to be built. Because if you lay foundations now, then after the settlement freeze date goes in, it doesn't matter, you can keep building. Settlement freeze date goes in. A month passed, 2 months passed, 3 months passed, and all Palestinians see around them is settlements keep getting built. They walk away from negotiations, and again, Israel can say, look at the Palestinians walking away from negotiations. We fulfilled our part of the deal. Sort of the final straw was when, for the Israelis, was when Hamas and Fatah decided to unify their governments. Now, the last thing that you want as a colonialist government is for there to be any unification. It goes in complete defiance of the divide and conquer mentality. Unifying, the Palestinians unifying, and it's actually something that I think Israel is very happy to have also even within Israel, that our minorities, you know, you have a lot of division within Israel itself between the secular and the religious, between the rich and the poor, between the white Ashkenazi Jews and the Mizrahi Jews. Even within ourselves, there's a lot of division. And the government loves that, because if you don't unify, there's no chance that you can uprise against your government. If we're all segregated and separated from one another, there's no chance of us resisting together what's going on here.
So why did Palestinians object to that first Zionist colony in Palestine? And they explicitly said what they wanted to do, which is not to just live in this country. They said this country is Eretz Israel. It has to be transformed to become the Jewish state of Israel. It cannot remain multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural. It has to become the Jewish state of Israel. This is what they explicitly said, and proceeded to practice it, of course. So that is why we objected to it. It has nothing to do with them being Jewish. I'm sure if they were nice Martians or nice Buddhists or nice anything else, the same thing would have happened, right? It has nothing to do with their religious affiliation, if you want. It had everything to do with their intention to transform the country, a country that has been for 12 to 15,000 years multi-religious, multicultural, multilinguistic even, and they wanted to make it a Jewish state. This is the core of the problem, okay?
There are three types of house demolitions: punitive, military, and administrative. Punitive demolitions basically means demolitions carried out as a punishment, which is actually a leftover from the British Mandate, where they used to demolish the homes of Zionist militias for doing attacks on the British. And they've carried it on, and so they punish Palestinians for attacks on Israelis. Punitive house demolitions are a form of collective punishment. The second type of house demolitions are military demolitions. So these are demolitions carried out for any military purpose, either for land clearance, military infrastructure, or again so Israel has a policy of extrajudicial executions, where they will kill people outside of the court, sort of outside of taking them to court. During the attack on Gaza, they demolished the home of the head of Hamas's military wing, in fact only killing his family and kids. He wasn't even in the house. But that's an example of a military demolition. The third type of house demolitions is administrative. Basically means you don't have a permit to build. Palestinians know that the chances of them getting a permit to build, even if they apply for one, is minimum. So the majority of Palestinians build without a permit. Build without a permit, and then this is what happens.
Some people here now pay monthly, like a few $100s to the Israelis so that their house is not demolished. So I end up like paying rent to the Israelis. So an act of resistance, of course, is to continue to rebuild your house even when they demolish it. And many of these houses that were demolished were rebuilt 2 or 3 times.
But from the moment that that family have a house demolition order in their hand, they are living in a place of fear. They are waking up every morning and the first thing they're doing is checking to see if there are bulldozers outside their home. When you cause an entire population of people to live in a place of fear, that's state terrorism. And that's exactly what house demolitions are. It's state terrorism. Because when you demolish a home, you affect the entire community around that house. Now, on the day of the demolition, more often than not, the family will resist their demolition, the house demolition. So they use tear gas and stun grenades to get the family out of the house. Then a private contractor will go in and remove the belongings from within the house. And then the same contractor or another private contractor will demolish the home. At the end of the demolition, the family are handed a bill and they have to pay for the cleanup and for the demolition. What a horrible situation to find yourself in. I don't think any of us can imagine what it must be like to wake up in the morning and see bulldozers outside your house, knowing they're going to demolish your home. It's incredibly traumatic. You see higher rates of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and domestic abuse among families who've had their houses demolished. Palestinian women become incredibly disorientated after a demolition. The effect on children is devastating. In fact, there is a professor in Gaza who did research on suicide bombers and found that over 50% had had their houses demolished as children.